Hi everyone, this is Monique Abdaca from Pueblo, Colorado, and this is my Module 12, Teacher Reacts Negatively to Personnel Evaluation. To begin by summarizing the case, what is happening? There is a deadline for teacher evaluations and it is approaching, and me as the principal need to have my teacher evaluations submitted by a certain date. Mrs. Stevens, a teacher, is having apparent difficulties with attentiveness. Each time I observe her, she doesn't have a lot of class participation and a lot of students seem to be off task. The principal, me, has not given Mrs. Stevens actionable feedback, but recommends Mrs. Stevens not to be renewed. Now, Mrs. Stevens pointed this out to me during one of our prior meetings to the situation, when I addressed not renewing her contract. Mrs. Stevens threatened to take the principal, aka me, to court if she is not recommended for renewal because I have not given her actionable feedback. Again, who is involved? Mainly in this situation, the principal, me, and Mrs. Stevens, a teacher. And where and when did this event occur? It began with the evaluations in Mrs. Stevens' classroom. It obviously came into my office, and the time frame is about the end of the school year because teacher evaluations, the deadline is approaching. Are there any legal and ethical issues? Legal issues, there are none. The principal is following the evaluation process in place. Although we do not know where this is taking place, this is normally how the evaluation process is managed. And another legal issue, not so much a legal issue, but it's going to cost somebody their job, is the non-renewal of Mrs. Stevens, which could lead to a possible court case. That's why I have it listed under legal issues. There are some ethical issues. The principal pushed all of the evaluations off until the end of the year. And this is difficult because this, of course, is when students are most rambunctious, which isn't a fair evaluation for Mrs. Stevens. And second, the principal has given no actionable feedback for Mrs. Stevens, so it's hard for Mrs. Stevens to make a change in her rambunctious students. Mrs. Stevens is being recommended for non-renewal, and although is closed-minded to suggestions, has not received actionable feedback from the principal. So let's synthesize the facts. Again, the people involved: Mrs. Stevens, the principal, who is myself, and an important factor and people in this situation are her students. They're being affected by her teaching practices. The place that this is taking place, city is not mentioned. The school name is not mentioned, nor the grade level. But we do know that we are in Mrs. Stevens' classroom. We're not sure if she's a certain subject teacher, maybe she's an elementary teacher, it wasn't specific. And also it leads into my principal's office with the post-evaluations. And of course, our program is going to be the teacher evaluation program for each individual teacher, done by an administrator. So let's review and prioritize the information. The stakeholders in the situation that are obviously affected by any decision made are Mrs. Stevens, the principal, me, and her students. What damage has occurred to stakeholders? Mrs. Stevens could lose her job if the non-renewal is submitted to the superintendent or the supervisor. On another hand, if I don't submit the non-renewal for Mrs. Stevens, the principal, me, could be in legal trouble. Or actually, opposite way around. If the renewal is submitted and Mrs. Stevens takes us to court, then I'm in legal trouble. Sorry about that. And of course, if I do continue to let Mrs. Stevens teach without any strategies implemented for student attentiveness, there will be loss of learning for those students in her class. Can I learn more? Yes, I could learn more about the state that this is occurring in and the district policies for teacher evaluation. Those are kind of up in the air right now. They're not made blatantly clear to the case study. And then finally, do I know enough to make a decision? Option 1, evaluate options and consequences. So based off the information I know, I've come up with 3 different options that could work for this situation. Option number 1 is no action is taken. So I submit the recommendation for Mrs. Stevens' non-renewal. And here is a picture of her teacher evaluation form. The consequences of this option are that it could probe a legal case in Mrs. Stevens' favor, and it could cost Mrs. Stevens her job. It also would require me to find a new hire in place of Mrs. Stevens. That could be for 1 more month of the school year, depending on this time frame, or it could be for the next school year. Evaluate options and consequences. Again, we're looking at option 2, which is the comprehensive liberal action. Continue to let Mrs. Stevens teach with lack of attentiveness. So this means, again, I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to submit a non-renewal. I'm just going to continue to let Mrs. Stevens teach the way she currently is. The consequences could prove to have a lower student morale because kids probably aren't enjoying her class, creating issues with achievement and growth for any state assessments, because if they're not participating, they might not be listening as well. And option 3, give Mrs. Stevens actionable feedback about how to gain the attention of her students, offer her a peer mentor, and then implement peer walkthroughs in order to easily learn, implement new strategies. So in my mind, this option, it takes more time because, of course, to get this whole process moving, it's going to take more time. It would probably need to begin next school year. Also, peer walkthroughs would take away a lot of time because I would want to implement peer walkthroughs throughout my entire staff, not just with Mrs. Stevens. Of course, another consequence is Mrs. Stevens could still reject the feedback from her peers, as well as not implement strategies that she sees in other classrooms. And finally, there could be a lack of people that want to, or lack of other educators that want to mentor Mrs. Stevens because of the attitude she seems to have about feedback. Overall, I think the best option for the situation is option 3, giving Mrs. Stevens actionable feedback about how to gain the attention of her students, offer peer mentors, and implement peer walkthroughs in order to easily learn, implement new strategies. The first step of this would be do not submit the non-renewal for Mrs. Stevens. Of course, this option wouldn't be viable if she wasn't a part of our staff still. Second in this process, I would evaluate Mrs. Stevens once more, maybe at the beginning of next year's school year after things have quieted down, and I would offer strategies to increase attentiveness and participation of her students. I would also ask a peer mentor to come on board and offer strategies as well. Then I would reevaluate after those strategies had been told to Mrs. Stevens, tried in her classroom, and the ones that worked for her implemented. And finally, I would implement peer walkthroughs for the entire staff, 2 per month or quarter, depending on how long their plan times are, because all staff could benefit to view, learn, and implement new strategies in their classrooms. Teachers should be continuously learning, so there shouldn't be any pushback from my staff for this option. This way, everybody benefits, and I'm not just harping on Mrs. Stevens to improve her practices. That is the end of my presentation for Module 12 for EDL 851, Supervision and Evaluation of School Personnel. Thank you for making this class extremely informative.